Another two-parter for you this week. It just seems sensible to split this up into two different sections because it's once again a rather long chapter, pretty detailed in information. This week we're talking about spirituality in social work and how to incorporate the concept of spirituality into our work. For a long time, I think we, as a profession, believe that discussions about spirituality really didn't have a place in in our focus with clients for a number of different reasons. One of which is I think we were really quite caught up in the psychodynamic view of human development, and then in the interaction with the environment. And church was seen certainly as an institution that was in the many of our clients' environments, but it didn't really incorporate, I believe, the concept of spirituality when we talked about religion and church, given that a number of our clients don't really interact, don't attend church services, and in many respects would say that they really don't believe in religion. Of course, as this chapter clarifies, and we'll be talking about here very briefly, religion and spirituality are two different things, and focusing instead upon spirituality rather than religion, for the most part, I believe, helps us to understand how all of this fits into our practice and in working with the total human being, particularly for those of us who work in Alaska and work with Alaska Native clients. We have come to see over the years that the Alaska Native culture being blended into treatment is very important, and a part of that culture, a very important part of much of that culture, at least, has to do with the role of spirituality in relation to the world. Spirituality is defined in the text as a process of human development that focuses on the search for a sense of meaning, purpose, morality, and well-being. It is a development in relationship with oneself, other people, other beings, the universe, and ultimate reality, however understood, orienting around centrally significant priorities and having some sense of transcendence in one way or another. So spirituality here is a part of many religions, most religions, maybe all religions, but religion is not necessarily a part of spirituality. Religion, and this is a good definition from a sociology textbook as well, is it's an institutionalized pattern of values, beliefs, symbols, behaviors, and experiences that involves spirituality, a community of adherents, transmission of traditions over time, and community support functions that are directly and indirectly related to spirituality. One of the interesting things about religions, at least what we refer to as mainstream religions, is that religions often reflect the social and cultural and legal expectations of the society in which the religion exists, and vice versa. So oftentimes you'll find that the laws of government reflect the mainstream religions in that society. So, for instance, let's say, if I'm speaking from the standpoint of a Roman Catholic, and we have two different kinds of sins. There's the venial sin, which is sort of that minor sin, and then the mortal sin, which is those that really put your soul in grave danger according to the religion. And a mortal sin would include murder. Well, murder is also in society one of those law violations that can get you in prison for a long time, if not put to death. So that here society reflects the moral codes of a mainstream religion in that society, or vice versa. Transmission over time, of course, suggests that formalized religions tend to have existed over the course of centuries, perhaps, and these traditions and belief systems are handed down from one generation to the next. And then the community support functions. Well, for one thing, in times of crisis, you'll find newsreels a lot of times of people going to church when some horrible thing happens in a culture, whatever it might be, and this reflects that that people often turn to religion and their faith in times when their understanding of the world is shaken by an event of some sort. Now, getting back to spirituality, there are many symbolic themes, and actually, there are two slides with these, and I'm not going to read off this list to you, but a couple of things that I think probably are central to the concept of spirituality, and the first one, which is this concept of morality and ethics and justice. Spirituality for many people really involves, a view of what is right and wrong in life, what we should be doing, whether or not we should be contributing to the larger culture, how we should care for other people, how we should act around other people, and how this relates to the larger universe, so to speak. So that's one thing I think spirituality connects to, as well as the meaning, the nature and meaning of the self, and the reason for our existence. Altruistic service is one of those things, that social workers are often identified as having. Altruism is one of the motivations for getting into the field, and altruism has a lot to do with spirituality, socio-cultural traditions and myths and things like that, altered states of consciousness, revealed knowledge, prayer and meditation, quiet contemplation, these kinds of things. All of this, a path to enlightenment or salvation, and awareness of the earth and the non-human world. All of these connect into this into spirituality for the human being. This sense that somehow we are connected to the earth and to all life forms, and vice versa, is certainly a spiritual theme. And so these are a number of different themes that for different people have to do with what spirituality is all about. Now, I don't think anyone would necessarily say you have to have all 20 of these themes in your sense of spirituality, but I think there's certainly a lot of them that have meaning to spiritual individuals. Now, even though this slide is titled Spirituality in the U.S. and Globally, really we're talking about religious affiliation here, and so kind of undermines what I said earlier about there being two different things. But in any event, the reason I include this slide, and actually I think a little bit of this is cut off, so let me drag this. There it is. Is that just to get a sense of what's going on with formal religions, more or less, and you see that in the last, well, this was 2014, but in the 7-year period, Christianity, the affiliate people who identify themselves as Christians or whatever had dropped by almost 8%, whereas other religions are increasing, and unaffiliated being the largest group in this particular survey, at least identifying an increase. Now, these may still be spiritual people, but they don't identify themselves as being connected to any particular religion, formal religion at least. Now let's get back. Well, anyway, there's a little trouble with my PowerPoint program here. Spirituality in the U.S., there appears to be an increasing fluidity in religious affiliation. About a third of adults have changed their affiliation from that of their childhood. That can be a part of the typical individuation process, It's interesting when I look at my own family. I have Hungarian in my father's side of the family, and some German, and then total German, Southern German in my mother's side of the family. And so we have a real Roman Catholic background going back to generations. And my grandparents certainly were very faithful church attenders. My own mother and father saw to it that we all were sent off to church. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, I have a brother who was ordained a priest and retired from the priesthood a few years ago. And yet our own mother and father were kind of spotty in their attendance to church, but they always insisted that we attend every Sunday. And when I look at the younger generation now behind us, none of the children of my own kids nor my brother's kids attend the Catholic Church. Some of them have found other faiths and other religions that they relate to more closely, but there clearly has been a shift as now I'm a first generation native born American, okay, as are my brothers. My father was born in Europe, and so it does suggest some shift in terms of the process of being Americanized, I guess, or assimilated into the American culture. That the younger generation is moving away from the religion of our forebears, and whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I think if well, it whatever is most meaningful to the individuals who are making these choices, I think is best. So anyway, that's not uncommon, and like I said, about a third of us change our affiliation from that of our childhood. But at the same time, there still is a lot of evidence that spirituality is a concern in the United States, as evidenced by the fact that the increase of people who are looking for spiritual growth has increased rather dramatically in the decade that's covered on this in this slide. So it can be something connected with religious institutions, or it could be kind of, as it says, more of an experiential, personalized spirituality. Once again, we're looking at formal religions and not so much spirituality here, but looking at religions around the world. You see that the Christian religion, or Christian religions, I should say, are identified by about a third of the individuals around the world. The next largest religion, which is probably not a surprise to any of us who are aware of what's going on in the world and in different parts of the globe, the Muslim religion is the next largest group. And behind that, the Hindus and the unaffiliated come close behind. We often think of, when we think of institution of religions and things, we often think of Christianity and perhaps the Jewish faith, Judeo-Christian traditions as being the dominant force around the globe. And in fact, it's only about a third of the people of the globe associate themselves with those two religions that we consider to be the primary religions in the United States. And that's just an interesting fact that many of us don't quite understand, don't quite get. There are factors that really create some conflict and confusion as far as religion and spirituality is concerned. Modernism, that conflict between science and religion that really has been around through all time. I mean, back when the church with the capital C, I think they excommunicated Galileo because he proposed that the Earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. That man was not the center of the universe. And going into today, where you see religion and science in quite a big debate and a struggle for, let's say, our souls, in issues about abortion and stem cell research, sexual behaviors, the role of women, and those kinds of things are all reflected in the impact that modernism has on religion. Multiculturalism confuses religion for a lot of people because we look for religion to present us with the answer to all the problems and the difficult questions in our life, and multiculturalism brings in a lot of different views that really make us wonder, create some conflict in what is really the true belief, the true religion, those kinds of things, and the kind of excessive and unnecessary fears that have been generated in the United States over the last 10 or 20 years about the Muslim religion and Muslim Americans is a good example of that. It's just simply a religion and a faith that a lot of us in the United States don't understand at all, and thus have a lot of misperceptions about it. And I think the book says, in the olden days, if the Christians and the Muslims fought, they threw rocks at each other, or maybe bow and arrows and things like that. And nowadays, we have things like nuclear weapons. And so religion, the conflict between religions, at least, and again, this is fairly evident in today's world, I think, in many respects, have the potential really to destroy mankind. And so the question is, will our religious beliefs produce chaos or will we be able to produce community out of a shared sense of religion? And I think probably the answer to that question is a focus upon spirituality more than religion would give us the opportunity to turn that into a positive thing. The chapter moves into some discussion about theories of human development of the transpersonal nature. Now, the transpersonal theories is the notion that spirituality is an important dimension in our behavior. And this is really evident in a lot of the kinds of theories that we've studied over the years, like start with Carl Jung's theory of personality, which includes the physical, the mental, and spiritual realm of the self. He says that we all strive for unity and wholeness within each person, all those parts strive for unity and wholeness within each person. Jung talks about archetypes, these kind of broad views of what is, well, of what we can relate to, I guess, in our life, in our world, and the spirit is an important archetype in his view. Sagioli, I don't know how to pronounce that, to be honest with you. He emphasized the spiritual dimension in his approach called psychosynthesis. And this suggests that some of the things that we see as psychological disturbances really might be spiritual awakenings instead, that we should be. And this we touch on later in this chapter as well, this question. What is a disturbance? What is a spiritual crisis or a spiritual awakening? And finally, Maslow, his hierarchy of needs. I mean, there's been a lot of interpretations of that, I suppose, but the apex of that hierarchy need is, I believe, the self-actualized individual. Here is referred to as transcendent self-actualizers. They are optionally functioning people. So, more on this later on, also. There are 4 therapeutic approaches that have emerged over the past century, and first, second, third, and fourth force therapies. First force therapies really kind of looking at dynamic theories of human behavior. I think this is really kind of the psychoanalytic kind of view, about the unconscious kind of driving things. Second force therapies evolved from behavioral theories that look at how behaviors are tied to emotions and how those things can be altered and changed. The third force therapies are the sort of that existential and humanistic kind of view of the mankind is always growing and evolving and wanting to become more self-actualized. And the fourth force therapies really is based on transpersonal theories and specifically involve the spiritual dimension of human existence. What differentiates the fourth force, that transpersonal approach, from the other orientations is the premise that some states of human consciousness and potential go beyond traditional views of health and normality. And this, again, as I said, specifically talks about human existence. If you look at the definition of the term transpersonal, it means beyond or through the persona or mask. So when applied to theories of human behavior, transpersonal means going beyond identity tied to the individual body and ego or social roles to include the spiritual experience and higher levels of consciousness. The self in the transpersonal view is experienced as in unity with all others. So this is kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about here when we look at transpersonal theory, and the major focus is really upon humanity's highest potential. The transpersonal practice approaches must include the whole, not just the high end of human experience, but the very personal realm of ordinary consciousness as well. And so we look at a couple of different theories in this chapter about faith development and the growth of a sense of consciousness and spirituality. First, just a couple slides on the theories of James Fowler and his theory of faith development. Now, Fowler referred to faith, which, is different from religion or spirituality, right? It's, and this is often a question a lot of people have, for instance, again, talking about and I've written about this a little bit in some of the discussion boards early in the semester, I think, the introductory semester. So many of us talked about, including myself, about how, religion had such a major impact upon us as a younger person, and how we've kind of stepped back from that and looked at it and either reincorporated it or moved on to other things. The question oftentimes is put to me, if there are certain things about my own religion, belief system or whatever, that I don't necessarily believe in, how is it that I can continue to practice the religion more or less on a regular basis? For instance, the topic of abortion, which for me personally has one meaning that probably fits with what the church wants me to think, but in the lives of others, I don't believe the government or I, as a social worker, have a right to impose my beliefs on my clients. Now, my church would disagree with that, but my social work training says this is the case. It dictates this, that we all have a right to self-determination and those kinds of things. So there's a difference there. I mean, and I think part of the difference to me is about faith. Is I practice the faith, but I don't necessarily buy into everything the religion has to dictate, let's say, or to offer to me in terms of how I should live my life. And both of those to me are separate from my sense of my spiritual self. They're a part of it, but they're only one part of it. So again, looking at faith as still a different concept, Fowler kind of looked at this as a kind of a centering process that underlies the formation of beliefs and values, and it gives coherence. Look at how this ties very closely in some respects to the definition of religion we had earlier, gives coherence and direction to people's lives. It links them in shared trust and loyalties to other people. It gives some grounding to their personal beliefs and loyalties in a larger frame of reference. And it enables them to face and deal with the limited conditions of life. In other words, well, he refers to it what is the quality of ultimacy in their lives, that there are certain things, I guess, that we cannot control and that will occur regardless. So it gives us the opportunity. Our faith enables us basically to deal with uncertainties and things beyond our control. At least that's how I see that. So the text says there's 6 stages in Fowler's stages of faith development, then proceeds to give us 7 stages. But that's only if you count pre-stage, and apparently that's not supposed to be. But you can see how these stages move. An individual, in Fowler's theory at least, would move through these stages as they develop and they get older and more mature. This ties in very closely to a lot of other theories. Erickson's theories really come to mind. When you look at that pre-stage, that primal faith, trust in the universe is the trust versus mistrust. So in a sense, I think Fowler's taken some of Erickson's theories and kind of transferring it from the parent and our social relationships to the larger context of the universe, so to speak, and the larger sense of existence that we all have. And I just think it's interesting, he talks about the use of magical thought and intuitions, which, is a hallmark of younger children's cognitions and those kinds of things. How in stage 2, and stage 3, the faith stages there tie very much into concrete thinking. If you look at that, it ties into the whole Piaget theories in terms of the development of cognitions and things like this. There's sort of a shallow kind of connection in the stage 3 to the faith. It's not like it's really been examined, but stage 4, individuated reflective faith, I think reflects our growth through adolescence. Where all those things we've been told are demystified and we begin to step back from that and begin to analyze those stages and form our own belief systems. It's interesting, I think, that he says that only 1 in 6 adults ever really reach the stage of conjunctive faith where ambiguity is tolerated, and I think there's a need a lot of us have when we turn to our religions. We're looking for some direction in terms of right and wrong. At least a lot of people are, and that ambiguity can be very disturbing to individuals who are looking for concrete answers to these kinds of things. And stage six, that universalizing faith, is something that I think very few people, he would say, ever achieve that stage. So and he says, as does Erickson and a lot of other theorists, that the early experiences set the stage for later faith development. Now, the next theory set of theories that are examined are Ken Wilber's theories about consciousness, and this really, there's a lot of talk or a lot of spirituality concept that's covered in these theories here. Wilber's theory is rooted in both conventional Western knowledge and in also the contemplative and mystical tradition of Eastern religions and other spiritual perspectives. And he has a human development matrix, I guess you could call it, that goes across four quadrants. Those are the interior individual, the exterior individual, the interior collective, and the exterior collective. And I have to tell you that his theory really causes me to spend some time thinking about what he's trying to say, because it is a very much very abstract, as I guess you would think some theories of spirituality and consciousness would be, and so it really does take some contemplation, I think, to integrate a lot of what he says in these things. So the individual interior, for instance, really is about the personal meaning and sense of self, and the exterior has more about our physical body and the things that we do that can be observed. Whereas when you look at the collective, it's more about cultural and institutional values and actions and things like that. What I think perhaps is a little more direct in meaning, well, perhaps not, but he says there's five major components regarding the development of the interior individual consciousness, which is, quadrant rather, the individual interior quadrant. That's the upper left quadrant there. Upper right? It's upper left. I have that somehow. That's wrong. I don't know if that's wrong in the book or in my slide, or in the slide. But in any event, he says there's five major components relative to the interior individual consciousness, and that is levels of consciousness. Now, this is again where it becomes a little abstract. These are developmental milestones, waves of consciousness, and perhaps Fowler's theory kind of fits into those levels. The different stages of development. Then there's multiple lines or streams of consciousness. These are sort of the different areas, let's say, of consciousness development, around morals and ideas, senses of altruism, empathy, those kinds of things. So you have the milestones, and then you have these streams of consciousness. Different would imply that some individuals may be well developed for instance, in altruism and morals, but less developed in empathy. That makes sense, really. So that it isn't just a single kind of unilateral kind of development, more or less. There are states of consciousness that include the normal, this is waking, sleeping, those kinds of things, and then the abnormal, which includes things like altered states and meditative states and those kinds of things. The levels, lines, and states of consciousness are all navigated by the self system, moving from the narrow sense of self to deeper senses of self. And finally, the self goes through a fulcrum or a switch point in moving through these stages, so that there's first an identification with a certain value, and then there's a disidentification with it, a challenge to it, and a new identification that integrates into the old sense of self. And so this fulcrum has these three stages in it, as one moves from one sense of self, one stage in development, to another. Now, he says that you don't have to master all of the competencies on one level to move on to the next, but you can't skip over the levels. Again, that's one of those things I think it takes a little bit of time to really think about, to really integrate that. So if you're left a little confused by some of this, I guarantee you're not alone. Now his spectrum of consciousness is further characterized. You see how complicated this whole theory is. And three phases of development: the pre-personal, the personal, and the transpersonal. And perhaps these are the. I'm going to go back here and take a stick my neck out and say somehow this probably relates to the levels of consciousness and his five major components. And so three phases, three levels. The pre-personal, which is, again, very childish, the pre-ego kind of phase. The personal, which is, when we have a strong sense of self, I believe, and have a belief of who we are. And then that transpersonal, which really goes beyond the ego to involve higher levels of consciousness. So I think we didn't really talk about the first six, and I'm not sure even the textbook really talks about the first six levels of consciousness, but it refers to Fowler's levels instead. It can be really thought to be very similar to that, but the first six levels of consciousness are experienced in the pre-personal, personal, and transpersonal phases. Beyond those first six levels of consciousness are three levels that Wilber adds and would be added to Fowler's theories if you want to connect to that. And this is the psychic, the subtle, and the causal. Level 7, a strong sense of connection to nature. You can see where the individual now is reaching beyond the self here. Level 8, a communion with the deity or God. And level 9, which is full enlightenment, the ultimate release, and pure nirvana. World and life begin to be perceived in more holistic and interconnected terms as an individual moves through these transpersonal levels. This it's interesting to me as I was studying this. It reminded me of a reading I made many years ago. When I was, well, it wasn't that many years ago, but a while ago when I was first out of college with my bachelor's degree, and going through my own young adult experience with kind of stepping back from my given faith and studying things. And I read a lot of books during that period of time about the meaning of existence. And one of the ones that stood out was Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which some of you are familiar with, I believe, probably. The Power of Positive Thinking, Norman Vincent Peale's book, which really was very not Catholic, but still very powerful. Og Mandino was a motivational writer. He wrote a book called The Choice, which was another a very important book in my early sense of spiritual development, I think. The Crack in the Cosmic Egg, which was another thing about what is real and what isn't, and how reality is defined from one culture to another very differently. And another book that I read was by the French Jesuit priest paleontologist by the name of Teilhard de Chardin. And forgive if you know French, forgive the pronunciation of that, but de Chardin was a French Jesuit priest. Actually, his writings were banned by the Catholic Church for a long time because they were so revolutionary, so counter-institutional. But he was a paleontologist, and I think he was involved in some of the diggings that where they found some earliest mankind in China, I believe, or whatever. I forget the name of the person that was dug up, but it might have been Lucy, even, I think. So he has this kind of dual view of the world, where he's trained in religion, but he's also looking at human development, or rather, evolution in a physical sense as well. And as you know, science and religion have different descriptions about, or different beliefs about evolution. And so anyway, he writes this book that kind of blends the two concepts in. And he also had a pyramid in his theory, and his theory said that the base of the pyramid are those single cell organisms and everything. And then as you move up the pyramid, the human existence, the creature, let's say the living creature, becomes more complicated, more developed biologically, spiritually, all these kinds of things. And above the pyramid, in his theory, above the pyramid where human beings exist, he placed Jesus Christ above them, saying that his powers to to heal the sick according to the Bible and to raise people from the dead and those kinds of things really showed that he had developed further than most human beings had up to that point, and to this day probably very few human beings would have reached that stage if this theory is accurate. But he said nonetheless that is sort of he's at that point in the apex to show us where we're headed to, where to go next. And he said as creation moves through this pyramid, when it reaches the very tip of the pyramid, the apex of the pyramid, that's where God is. And his implication is that human life, or life in general, is evolving and evolving into, when it's finally complete, it will have evolved into God. And I think he thought that's when the end of the world comes, So anyway, you can kind of see, traditional Roman Catholic thinkers might not like that too much because, well, but it tied into a lot of things, even from my own teachings in my own church about, as a little boy, about how we relate to God and things like this. So anyway, just as that's an aside, but it really kind of, this theory here, especially as he talks about communion with God and full enlightenment and all this, really tied a lot into that reading. That was T.R. Desjardins. The name of the book was Building the Earth. I don't even know if it's in print anymore. Probably is. Wilbur also goes on to suggest a level 10, which really to me kind of complicates all of this, to where I thought I understood what was going on, and now I have to rethink this a little more. But it's not really a separate level, but it's the ground for all levels, the paper on which the figure is drawn, so to speak. And this interior sense of being a witness disappears, and the witness turns out to be everything that is witnessed. Now, that causes us to stop and think, doesn't it? But anyway, emptiness becomes pure consciousness itself. Beyond ego or self, we move to self-transcendence and unity with the universe. And he says that every human being has the capacity to reach this level for this evolution, let's say, in our existence. But needless to say, very few people ever reach higher interpersonal levels like that. Interesting, isn't it? I just I found this particular passage to be very, very interesting. So Wilbur's and I don't know, some of you may have already studied Wilbur, and forgive me if I seem very naive in this presentation, because this is new to me, and perhaps maybe I shouldn't be teaching it, but it just I think it's probably new to a lot of us. And for those of you that have studied it before, I surrender the floor for anything you'd like to add to what I have to offer here. So anyway, there are a few things that we're starting to get into, kind of concrete things now about working with people and applying this theory. And there are a few things I think he called pathologies. I would say pitfalls in applying these theories. And he calls one the pre-trans fallacy, which can occur when a level development is mistaken for a problem at a transpersonal level is treated as a personal disorder, so that a spiritual awakening is confused with some sort of a psychotic episode or a personal crisis of some sort. And then also spiritual bypassing is another thing, which he says individuals I think it wasn't actually Wilbur that said this, but another theorist who labeled this as a tendency that some of us have to use spiritual practice to avoid dealing with personal or emotional issues. This gives the individual the attempt to avoid the pain of working through unresolved psychosocial issues, but it doesn't work really in the long run and often causes other problems. To me, this involves people that we run into sometimes, that seem to be very deeply wedded to their religion and almost, well, and again, I hesitate to say this in this particular lecture, but in a way that seems like there are some real psychological neediness involved in that, and I think that's what they're talking about here. So when you look at the Fowler's and Wilbur's theories, there's a couple things that maybe to take away from this. Is Wilbur's theories provides more substance and is more specific than Fowler's theory. about what transpersonal levels of development look like and how they evolve. He also provides more detailed descriptions of the pitfalls of spiritual development than Fowler does. But Fowler gives us more specificity about the content and process of spiritual development at the pre-personal and personal phases than Wilber does. So for practice, Fowler's model is more descriptive, Wilber's is more prescriptive. Just some things for you to give some thought to, I suppose, if you're looking at ways to integrate some of this into what you do with people. So, very esoteric kind of discussion today, I guess is the word I'm looking for here. It's just some real interesting concepts to think about when we think about the definition, or rather the use of spirituality, I should say, in our work. In the next part, we're going to look more at how spirituality connects to practice and to the individuals that we encounter in our work, and how we can use some of that in assessment. So that's the end of part 1. Talk to you in a minute in another chapter.